The night my husband of 34 years stood at that podium, straightening his tie, smiling at the crowd, was the same night I decided I was done being invisible. I should back up. I should tell you how we got there. Because none of it happened overnight. Betrayal never does. It creeps in slowly. So slowly that you convince yourself you're imagining it. You fold the laundry. You make the coffee. You tell yourself that this is just what marriage feels like after 3 decades. You tell yourself that the distance is normal. That men go quiet. That it doesn't mean anything. I told myself all of those things. For almost 2 years, I told myself every single one. My name is Cecilia, and I am 63 years old. I taught elementary school for 26 years in Oakville, Ontario. I raised 2 children in a house I planted a garden in front of every spring since 1998. I baked bread on Sundays. I drove my mother to her chemotherapy appointments every Tuesday for 14 months without ever once missing a session. I am not a woman who gives up easily, and I am not a woman who makes scenes. Which is why what happened at the Lakeview Heritage Society Gala last October surprised even me. My husband, Lawrence Hadley, was 66 years old and had spent the last 22 years building what most people in our community considered an impeccable reputation. He was a restoration architect. He specialized in preserving historic buildings, the kind of man who could walk into a crumbling Victorian home and see exactly what it had once been, what it could be again. People loved him for that. They said he had a gift for seeing beauty where others saw ruin. The irony of that is not lost on me now. We met in 1989 at a conservation fundraiser in Hamilton. I was there with my colleague from school. He was there with his university roommate. He was tall and a little awkward, the kind of man who spills his wine when he laughs too hard, which he did that night, right down the front of his shirt. And he looked so mortified and so endearing all at once that I handed him my napkin. And we talked for 3 hours without noticing that almost everyone else had gone home. By the following spring, we were engaged. By autumn, we were married in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard in Burlington. And my mother cried so much during the vows that she had to borrow the ring-bearer's handkerchief. Those were real years. I want you to know that. I am not the kind of woman who rewrites her own history to make the ending easier to swallow. We had real years, Lawrence and I. We had a son. Our boy Oliver Hadley, who is now 31 and works in environmental law in Vancouver. We had a daughter, Annette, who is 28, sharp as a tack, and stubborn in exactly the way I used to pretend exhausted me but secretly made me proud. We had a life, a genuinely good one. And then somewhere around the time Lawrence turned 64, something shifted, and I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky gives anything away. He started working later. That was the first thing. Lawrence had always kept reasonable hours. One of the few architects I ever knew who genuinely believed in leaving the office before 6. But then it was 7, then 8, then sometimes 9, and when I asked, he would say the Millbrook Station project was more complicated than expected, that the Heritage Board had new requirements, that he was meeting with contractors. And I believed him. Because why wouldn't I? He had never given me a reason not to. Then came the phone. He had always been careless with his phone the way people who have nothing to hide tend to be. Leaving it face up on the kitchen counter, answering calls on speaker while he made toast. But suddenly the phone was always face down. Suddenly he stepped out of rooms to take calls. Suddenly he had a new passcode I didn't know. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But noticing is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as being ready to do something about it. So I kept noticing, and I kept folding the laundry, and I kept making the coffee. The first time I met Renata Voss was at a planning committee open house in September of the year before the gala. She was standing near the heritage display boards, in a cream blazer, talking to the committee chair, and Lawrence introduced her to me as a preservation consultant he had recently brought onto the Millbrook Station project. She was perhaps 40, 42 at most. She had that particular kind of effortless polish that I have always suspected takes an enormous amount of effort. She shook my hand and said, "It was lovely to meet me," and her smile was smooth and warm and gave away absolutely nothing. I remember driving home that night and thinking, I'm being paranoid. She's a colleague. She was perfectly pleasant. I'm a 62-year-old woman who has been reading too many novels. I went home and I made tea and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about it for a long time. And then I called our son Oliver in Vancouver. Oliver had noticed things too. He hadn't said anything to me directly. He would tell me later that he hadn't wanted to upset me without being sure, but he had noticed them. The way his father seemed distracted at Christmas that year. The way Lawrence had seemed irritated, almost impatient, during Oliver's visit in the spring, as if he had somewhere else he needed to be. Oliver is perceptive in the quiet way that comes from being a thoughtful child who grows into a thoughtful adult. And when I finally said to him on the phone that September, "I think something is wrong?" he didn't tell me I was imagining it. He said, "I think you might be right, Mum, and I think we should be careful about what we do with that." That was the beginning of the careful part. I want to be clear about something. I did not set out to expose Lawrence publicly. That was never the plan. The plan, if you could call it that, in those early months when I was still half hoping I was wrong, was simply to know. To understand what was actually happening in my own marriage. I deserved that much. After 34 years, I deserved to know what was real. I have a friend. A woman I have known, since our children were in the same Brownie troupe in the early 90s, named Harriet Lowe. Harriet is one of those people who seems to know everyone and remembers everything, and she had worked for 12 years as an office administrator in a law firm before retiring. She had a matter-of-fact way of dealing with difficult situations that I had always admired, and when I finally told her what I suspected, she didn't wring her hands or burst into tears or tell me to go see a couples therapist. She said, "Right, let's think about what you actually know and what you still need to find out." Over the course of that autumn and winter, I found out quite a lot. I found out that Renata Voss had been brought onto not one but 3 of Lawrence's projects in 18 months, despite having no prior professional relationship with his firm before that. I found out that Lawrence had made 3 separate transfers from our joint savings account, not enormous amounts, but significant ones, $2,000 here, $1,500 there, to a personal account I hadn't known existed. I found out, through Harriet's careful and completely above-board inquiries, that Renata Voss had recently signed a lease on a condominium in Port Credit that was very generously appointed for someone whose consulting business had only been incorporated 2 years prior. I sat with all of that for a long time. Christmas came and went. Oliver flew in from Vancouver, and we had a quiet holiday. Lawrence was distracted and excused himself from dinner twice to check his phone, and I smiled and served the turkey and poured the wine and said nothing. Annette noticed her father's distance and pulled me aside in the kitchen on Boxing Day and said, "Mum, is everything all right?" And I told her, "Everything is fine, sweetheart," because I was not ready yet. I was not ready because I still didn't know exactly what I was going to do about it. It was in January that Lawrence came home one evening and told me about the gala. The Lakeview Heritage Society held its annual gala every October, a fundraising dinner for heritage preservation projects across the region. Lawrence had attended before, but this year was different. This year, the society was presenting him with their Cornerstone Award, given annually to an architect or preservationist whose career had made a sustained contribution to Ontario's built heritage. It was a significant honor. The mayor would be there, heritage board members, donors, city councilors, prominent builders, all of the people whose opinion Lawrence cared about most. He told me about it over dinner with a kind of careful casualness, the way people announce things they're excited about, but don't want to appear too excited about. He said the ceremony would be in October, that it would be a formal dinner at the Lakeview Grand Hotel, that he hoped I would join him. I said I would be delighted. I meant it too, just perhaps not in the way he assumed. I spent the following months being very quiet and very methodical. I consulted a family lawyer, a woman named Patricia Ning, who came highly recommended by Harriet, and I understood clearly where I stood. I organized our financial records. I made careful copies of everything relevant. I had one very long and very honest conversation with Oliver, and a second one with Annette, who took the news with a silence that eventually gave way to a fury she kept impressively contained out of love for me. She wanted to confront her father immediately. I asked her to wait. I asked both of my children to wait, just a little longer, just until I was fully ready. "What are you planning, Mum?" Annette asked me in August, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug. I told her I wasn't planning a scene. I told her I was planning a conclusion. The weeks before the gala, I handled several things quietly. I met again with Patricia Eng. I prepared what I needed to prepare. I arranged for Oliver to fly in from Vancouver. I told him the gala was important and that I would like him there, which was the truth, just not the whole of it. I bought a dress, a deep burgundy one with long sleeves, because October in Ontario can be cool and because I wanted to feel like myself. I got my hair done. I called my sister in Guelph and had a long conversation I had been putting off for months. And I made sure that what needed to be shown could be shown. The evening of the gala was clear and cold. One of those perfect October nights in the Greater Toronto area, when the sky is very dark and very full, and the air smells like fallen leaves and something final. Lawrence was in high spirits getting ready. I had not seen him that animated in a long time, and he wore his good charcoal suit and the blue tie I had given him for our 30th anniversary. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a while before we left. The way people do when they want to appear a certain way to other people. Oliver met us in the hotel lobby. He had flown in that afternoon. He was wearing a suit and his face was composed and careful, and when he hugged me he held on for a moment longer than usual and I squeezed his arm. The ballroom at the Lakeview Grand was everything a certain kind of ambition looks like when it's dressed in cloth napkins and candlelight, round tables with cream linens, a podium and stage at the front, a large presentation screen above the stage. There were perhaps 200 people in attendance. Lawrence knew many of them and moved through the room with ease, shaking hands, accepting congratulations he already knew were coming. I walked beside him and smiled and said hello to the people I recognized, and I drank one glass of white wine very slowly because I wanted to be entirely clear-headed. I noticed Renata Voss arrive about 20 minutes after us. She was wearing a dark green dress, and she came in with 2 other people I didn't recognize. She and Lawrence did not speak to each other directly. They were careful. They had always been careful in public. But I watched her find her table, and I watched him glance toward her when he thought no one was paying attention. I was paying attention. I had been paying attention for a very long time. Dinner was served. Speeches began. There were 3 awards that evening. The Cornerstone Award was last. Lawrence grew quieter as the evening progressed, that particular quietness of a man gathering himself. The first 2 recipients were recognized warmly, and the room was in good spirits. Well-fed, well-watered, in the generous mood of people who have given to a cause they believe in. When they called Lawrence's name, the room applauded with the genuine warmth that real respect sounds like. And he walked to the podium, and I watched 200 people look at him the way he had always wanted to be looked at. He thanked the society. He thanked his colleagues. He spoke about the importance of remembering where we came from, about how a building is never just a building, but a record of the lives lived inside it, about how his greatest honor as an architect had been to help this community preserve what mattered. And then he said, "Most of all, I want to thank my family." He looked at Oliver. He looked at me. 34 years, he said. "Cecilia, thank you for being beside me through all of it." The room made the soft collective sound of people who find that sort of thing touching. I looked at my husband standing at that podium, under those lights, in front of every person whose respect he had spent his career cultivating, and I thought, all right, Lawrence, this is the moment. I had arranged with the audio-visual technician, a young man I had contacted directly 3 weeks prior, explaining that I was the award recipient's wife, and had prepared a brief personal tribute to add to the presentation, to have a USB drive loaded at a specific moment in the program. He had been professional and accommodating. He hadn't asked many questions. People rarely ask many questions of a well-dressed woman in her 60s who speaks calmly and knows exactly what she wants. The screen behind Lawrence, which had been displaying the society's logo, shifted. What appeared was not complicated. It did not need to be. There were the bank transfer records, printed clearly, amounts and dates, transfers from our joint account to the account I had tracked. There was a copy of the lease on the Port Credit condominium, with Lawrence's signature on the guarantor line. There was a series of messages. Recovered through means, I will leave to your imagination, between Lawrence and Renata Voss, that left absolutely nothing ambiguous about the nature of their relationship, including one in which Lawrence described, in considerable detail, how he planned to restructure his assets in the coming year. The room went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience paying attention. The stunned, airless quiet of 200 people processing something they did not expect and cannot immediately make sense of. Lawrence turned around. I watched his face in the moment he understood what was on the screen behind him. I have thought about that moment many times since. There was the initial confusion, his brain refusing the information, and then the recognition, coming in like cold water, and then something that looked almost like grief, though I'm not certain it was grief for the right things. He turned back to face the room. He didn't speak. I don't think he could. Someone in the back of the room said quietly, "Oh my God!" A few people near Renata Voss's table turned to look at her. She had gone very still. I stood up from my chair. I did not shout. I did not make the kind of scene I had promised myself I would not make. I simply stood, and I looked at my husband of 34 years, and I said, clearly enough for the tables near me to hear, "I think that says everything that needed to be said, Lawrence." And then I picked up my purse, and Oliver stood up beside me, my steady, quiet son, who had not known exactly what was going to happen, but had known enough to be there. And we walked out of that ballroom together, while 200 people sat in silence. The cold air outside the Lakeview Grand Hotel hit my face like something I had been waiting for. Oliver took my arm when we reached the steps, and we stood there for a moment in the October dark, and he said, "Are you all right, Mum?" And I said, "I think so. I think I actually am." We found Annette waiting in the car. She had driven in that afternoon as well. I had asked her to wait outside, because I had not wanted her in the room, not because I needed protecting, but because I knew her, and I knew what her face would have done. And I could not have kept my composure watching her composure break. When we got in the car, she looked at my face for a long moment and then said, "It's done?" And I said, "It's done." She drove without speaking for a while, and then she reached over and took my hand, and that was enough. Lawrence came home very late that night. I was awake. I had not expected to sleep, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea. He stood in the doorway for a long time without saying anything. He looked like a man standing in a house he no longer recognized, which I suppose in a way he was. He said my name. Just that. "Just Cecilia," I said. "The papers are on the table." He looked at the manila envelope that Patricia Ing had helped me prepare, sitting next to the fruit bowl in the middle of the kitchen table, and something moved across his face that I couldn't fully read. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." He said, "I don't know how this happened." And I said, "Yes, you do, Lawrence. You just don't want to say it out loud." He sat down in the chair across from me, and I let him sit there, and I drank my tea, and after a while he picked up the envelope. I won't tell you that the months that followed were easy. They were not. They were lonely in ways I hadn't expected, and full of paperwork in ways I had. There were conversations I had to have with people I hadn't wanted to involve, explanations I had to give to neighbors and friends, a certain amount of gossip I had to accept I couldn't control. The Heritage Society sent me a very thoughtful note. Oliver called every few days. Annette came to stay for 2 weeks in November, and we reorganized the guest room and took long walks along the lake and ate takeout Thai food 3 nights in a row without apologizing to anyone about it. I filed for divorce in November. Lawrence did not contest it. Renata Voss, as it turned out, ended her arrangement with Lawrence rather quickly after the gala. The condominium in Port Credit was quietly vacated by spring. I can't say I was surprised. I had suspected, and I was right, that what she had wanted was resources and proximity to the kind of reputation Lawrence had spent 30 years building, and that reputation had sustained considerable damage. She moved on, I'm told, in the efficient way of people who have always had a next plan. Lawrence resigned from 2 of his board positions in the weeks following the gala. He still practices, as far as I know. We do not speak, except through our lawyers when we have to. There is something I want to say about the night of the gala, about the moment I stood up in that ballroom, that I haven't been able to say to very many people directly. I want to say it here, because I suspect some of you listening to this may know exactly what I mean. I was not triumphant walking out of that room. I want to be honest about that. I was not vindicated in any simple way. What I felt, walking out through those heavy doors into the cold October air, was something closer to relief. The kind of relief that comes when you stop carrying something you have been carrying for too long. Not joy, not victory, just the first clean breath after a very long time of breathing something that wasn't quite right. I turned 63 in February. Oliver flew in from Vancouver and Annette drove up from Toronto, and we had dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Oakville that I have loved for years. And it was noisy and the pasta was very good, and we laughed at things that weren't entirely funny, and it didn't matter. My sister came. Harriet came. It was a table full of people who had chosen to be there. And I looked around at all of them and I thought, this is what I have. This is what has always been real. The garden is coming in early this year. The tulips I planted along the front walk in October, the same weekend as the gala, as it happens, because the bulbs needed to go in and I wasn't going to let anything stop me, came up in April, red and yellow, more of them than I expected. I stood on my front step and looked at them for a long time. 34 years is not nothing. I will not pretend it is nothing. But I am 63 years old and I have good children and a garden that comes back every spring, and a friend who helped me think clearly when I most needed it. And I have, at last, a life that is entirely and honestly my own. That, I have learned, is not a small thing. That is everything.